Hey there, sports fan. This is Kit, and this is Untold Wrestling. This is the stories I promise you you've never heard any of these stories before. You might be a wrestling fan. You might be a huge wrestling fan. These are things I have dug up from all different time points in history, from the annals of history, the deep, just dug in like a tick. I found these things and pulled them out and brought them to you. This is the only place you will ever find these stories, I promise. Some of them are mysterious. Some of them, they're not all going to be unsolved mysteries. Some of them are going to be fun stories. Some of them are going to be sad stories. They're just reality, man. That's life. It's gritty and raw. This one is no different. And I'll just be honest. This one doesn't have a happy ending. So if you're ready for a happy ending, then keep listening, but just be disappointed by the end. But it starts out pretty happy. It starts out quite differently. We're going all the way back to 1890. All right. America, middle America. I'm talking Iowa, baby, 1890. So this is just 25 years after the Civil War. America's pulling itself back together. It's a generation after the big war. We're in Iowa. We're in a place called Grizzly Gulch. And maybe you've never heard of Grizzly Gulch, but how it got its title, how it got its name is, pardon the pun, pretty grisly. So about 100 years before our story, right in the late 18th century, a party of guys were coming through and they were staying in the area. And this town, it was nothing. It was just like a little, barely even just a place you'd stop, like a little filling station, basically, like a way station, basically, right? And so these guys stop, and they're not good guys, right? They were not good guys who stayed there. And basically what they did was they went around all over, as America hadn't started the full westward expansion yet, but it was moving out west, right? So it's just a few years after America became a thing, right? So these guys, like I said, they were not good guys. They made fake wax sculptures of like famous people in America. And it wasn't like celebrities like now. Like there wasn't like, you didn't get your celebrity news from the internet. You didn't tune on cable television to the E channel and watch Access Hollywood, right? To get your celebrity news. This is back when the biggest news you'd get was from either what someone told you or maybe the newspaper, right? So they would make wax sculptures of like George Washington, right? Everybody knew who that was. Thomas Jefferson, everybody knew who that was. Benjamin Franklin. But because they took advantage of the fact that no one really knew what a lot of these people looked like, because there weren't a lot of pictures floating around. And so they were terrible. These were terrible wax molded, life-size statues. And here's what they do. They'd go around and they'd go into town. They'd go up to like a fur trader or like, a tavern or whatever. And they would point out to their stagecoach out there and be like, hey, we got George Washington back there. He's sleeping. He wants some of your furs. He wants some of this whiskey, and it's the first president out there, right? Just recently, the former first president out there. It was like early 1800s. And, hey, it'd be a shame if he heard you charge this full price, let alone at all. And they would get free stuff like that. And immediately, word would go around town like, I don't know, because here's the thing about those wax sculptures. They were not good. They were terrible. And this has nothing to do with our hero of our story, but this is the setting, right? Where we start. So, these guys, they decide, all right, here's what they would do at night, right? They would sleep in the stagecoach and they would put the wax figures out around like the fire as it was dying. So if anyone ever ambushed them, they'd hope was they'd attack the wax figures and they'd be safe, right? What they didn't think about was where they were, because they were in the future Grizzly Gulch. And it's not called Grizzly Gulch because there aren't grizzly bears there. That's for sure. So grizzly bears in the middle of the night, they weren't fooled by wax statues. They could smell that they weren't people. They could probably smell that they weren't even good. Because listen, there's no photographs from the time of these things, but there's some drawings and some photographs of some of these wax statues that were left over and preserved in the museum and the Historical Society in Grizzly Gulch, Iowa. There's the Ben Franklin wax figure that was left over. But these were terrible. It looked like Ben Franklin was melting, right? It looked awful. It was like the Elvis impersonator version of Ben Franklin, right? So these bears weren't fooled. They crawled right in the stagecoach, ate these guys so fast they didn't even wake up, right? And then so shortly after, a few months later, townspeople who were all upset, they'd all been bamboozled, lost their money, found these guys, right? Found what was left of them, got their money back, and the town of Grizzly Gulch was formed. But we're not here to talk about the history of Grizzly Gulch. We're just here to talk about Grizzly Gulch's most famous resident of all time. And of course, I am talking about Bear Bottom Benny Jenkins. And that's Bear spelled B-E-A-R, right? Like Bear Bottom, not bear as in naked, although that does factor in later. So just put that in your hat, right? Like no spoilers, but it's coming up. So he was born in 1890, July 3rd, 1890 in Grizzly Gulch, but not in the town. It was about 17,500 people in the town at the time. So it was a pretty bustling little town, but he grew up out on a farm. You know, Benny, little Bear Bottom Benny grew up out on the farm. And the real date we need to talk about here is July 4th, 1894, one day after his 4th birthday. So he had 2 older brothers and 2 older sisters. He was the youngest. Benny was the youngest. So sisters were helping mom inside. The brothers were out front helping dad in the farm with the farm hands and everything. So Benny's just caught playing, right? So teddy bears hadn't come into full fashion at the time because those kind of came around Teddy Roosevelt. But the town was slowly becoming a bit of a tourist destination, even back then, even in the 1890s. And so they sold these stuffed bears in town, but they were expensive, and Benny's family couldn't afford them, so he made his own. He was a weird kid, man. He would collect like little hairs and furs from around the farm and like make these bears, and he just loved it. He was obsessed with bears, and no one else in his family was. I mean, aside from growing up in Grizzly Gulch, I mean, there was no bear event that happened that made him obsessed with bears, but he was from the day he was born. He would crawl around and make bear noises, and he was sitting on this day, July 4th, 1894. He's sitting out in his front yard, right? Just in a farm, the farm surrounded by woods, and he's playing with his bears. Nobody's paying attention. Nobody's paying attention to him. It was 1894. There's no iPad you can give this guy. You can't put Dora the Explorer on Nickelodeon cable television, sit him down in front of him, make him be fine. He's just playing in the yard, pal. We got work to do. This is a farm. So the story goes like this. Benny is sitting outside. He is playing with his bear stuffed animals, and an actual grizzly bear cub waddles up, crawls up to him, and starts playing with Bear Bottom Benny, starts playing with him. I don't know if it's because they could just, the bear could just sense that he loved bears, or that they could sense that, or they saw Benny acting like a bear because he would crawl around and make bear noises. There's no way for us to know. All we know is that the story goes, the grizzly cub was playing with Benny. And all we know is, we don't know why. We just have, Benny's account afterward, but the grizzly bear cub started crawling back toward the woods. Benny just followed it. He followed it. The cub let him follow all the way back to the den. Allegedly, Benny gets to the den. The mama grizzly bear takes him in, starts feeding him. Benny was missing for 23 days. His family thought he was dead. They did everything. They pulled out all the stops. They had search parties. They had dogs out there. It's not like now we'd have helicopters and people gritting things out, but they combed the woods. They couldn't find the bear. Because here's the thing. You might have noticed wildlife's kind of hard to find. You don't often just stumble upon bear dens, right? So they couldn't find him. They assumed he was dead. 23 days later, they had a funeral for the guy. They just assumed he was gone. Benny just walks back into the front yard one day, 23 days later. No shirt, covered in dried blood, fully fed, big fat old belly full of deer meat. And his family freaks out. They're so happy to see him. But then they start asking, well, where did you go? Where did you go? Then Benny got in trouble because they realized he was fine. They realized that he just went off on his own. They thought maybe he wandered off to the woods and got eaten by something, maybe a bear, right? But he hadn't. He was fine. He was better than when he left before. He was strong. He was healthy. He was happy. He was dirty, but he was happy looking. So he finally tells him where he'd been. his dad, his brothers, the farmhands, they start loading up. They get all the guns that they had. They get all their weapons. They're going to go out. They say, take us back to the bear cave. We're going to kill these bears, right? This isn't safe. Benny won't tell him. He refuses to tell him. They're threatening him. They're trying to tell him he's grounded. He's going to be in trouble. He's going to get whipping and all this. He won't do it. They follow Benny's trail because he crawled the whole way. They followed him back. These guys all with all their guns loaded for bear. They get back to the loaded for bear, pardon the pun. They get back to the den and it's empty. The bears are gone. You could tell they'd been there. Benny was telling the truth. Bear Bottom Benny told the truth. You could tell bears had been living there. There were bones. You could see where they'd been sleeping. You could see where Benny's ripped up clothes were from where he'd been wrestling with the other bears. But the bears were nowhere to be found. September 12th, 1899. Bear Bottom Benny's 9 years old. He was already known as Bear Bottom, by the way. He loved bears so much, even before that day that, he was gone for a month with the bears. But even afterward, he begged his mother to stitch bear paws into the back of his pants, both the two bear paws, one on each side of the back of his pants. So he was always called Bear Bottom Benny, even before he got into professional wrestling. That was always what he was known by. It's what he wanted to be known by. But he was at the county fair. It was the biggest event of the year, and it was not far away from his family's home, and that's where they would take down their livestock and take down all their produce and try to win contests and try to sell their wares and everything, the literal fruits of their labor. But Benny was no help at that. He's a little bear boy. He's a little bear bottom boy. He didn't care about that. He was running around making bear noises, trying to just go see the bears, because every year at the fair they had a bear. There was a bear farm. There's a local bear farm in Grizzly Gulch where they raised these bears and they would sell them off for people. They don't do it anymore, but back in this time you could get a bear and it would be like a protection animal. You could have around your house. So they would auction off these bears and stuff. And part of it was a show. They did a show every year where they would have bears perform. And there was one bear in particular named Whiskers, who was a semi-retired circus bear. And in the circus he used to ride, it wasn't a tricycle, but it was like this little cart he would ride, and they wore kind of like a fez type hat. And they would pull him on this cart and he would hop off, stand up on one foot and take his hat off and kind of extend it out, and pose for the kids. And the kids would go crazy. Because listen, like I said, there's no iPad. Right? There's no Angry Birds that these kids could play, right? There's no Dora the Explorer, like I said, they could watch. There's no Blue's Clues they could watch on television. No Nickelodeon Nicktoons. This is the entertainment they got. Once a year, the carnival would come to town. They'd go see Whiskers the bear. But he was semi-retired at this point. He was just doing the local fair circuit. And people just come, it'd be the equivalent of people nowadays going to take selfies. They just come look at him, right? And go write a letter to their grandma about how they saw the kind of famous bear. Well, Benny's obsessed. And these bears weren't kept in a cage. That's the crazy part. I know it was like 1899, but it's crazy. They weren't kept in a cage. They were kept in a pen like horses or pigs or something, right? You could just climb right over. And also, I'm no expert, but can't bears just climb over stuff? These were black bears. So I think they can climb. I'm sure they can climb over a fence. But nonetheless, different time. Benny is there, right? So Benny, he's sitting on top of the gate. And he's eating an ice cream cone. And the ice cream's kind of dripping down his hand, dripping down on his legs into his feet. And he's barefoot, of course, because they couldn't get shoes on the guy. He's always barefoot, right? Pardon the pun. But, and the bears, he's loving it. The bears are just licking the ice cream off his toes, right? Because they don't know the difference. And he's tickling them and he's laughing. He just a careless little boy just having a good time with these bears. He slips off and falls into the bear pen right at the paws of Whiskers, who, by the way, had a reputation for being a fun-loving, gentle bear. But guess what? It wasn't true. He was awful. That was just what they would tell people so that they would feel safe having their kids, hang out with him and come pay nickels to come see him. And again, just, it was the equivalent of taking selfies these days, right? Like it was just like, you come see the bear. He was awful. Whiskers was a nightmare. He was terrifying. He killed trainers. Like it was a nightmare. Well, it was the first time in his life Benny had been face to face with a bear and was afraid of it. This bear got up on its feet, had arms extended. I mean, black bears are like 5-6 feet tall, but when they fully extend their arms up and everything, like it's like 9 feet, this thing just howls out a big growl. So of course Benny's terrified. So he turns to try to run, but he slips in a big pile of bear shit. And he's slipping sliding like a Scooby-Doo character, allegedly, and he falls toward he gets spun around the other way and falls toward Whiskers and kind of like spears Whiskers with his shoulder by accident in the abdomen. And then to protect himself, he grabs onto Whiskers with both hands in the fur and starts falling backward and accidentally yanks, just protection, right? It's just a reflex, accidentally yanks Whiskers down to the ground, separating Whiskers' left shoulder. Whiskers goes, by this time, all this noise, I mean, everyone's running up and watching, but basically half the people are terrified, half the people are excited to watch this kid die, right? I think it's like 1899, man. Like this is like the faces of death video of the time. Like, oh yeah, kick ass. The kid's going to get eaten by a bear. Awesome. Only paid 15 cents to get in here. So anyway, Whiskers, breaks his shoulder, goes running off, scampering to the other side. It's like a big field, scampering off to the other side. All the other bears who were kind of riled up before, ready to kill this kid, are totally freaked out. There's a new bear alpha in the pen, right? Like bear culture is really intricate. You can look it up if you want, but it's very similar to gorilla culture, right? So, so Benny's just standing there, just mouth agape, because he's just thought he was going to die, and everyone's staring at him, and they start chanting Bear Bottom Benny, King of the Bears, King of the Bears. And that's how his first public association, aside from the story of him going out with the Grizzlies, that was his first like public incident with bears. And it was also the day, once again, September 12th, 1899 was the day that Benny realized he wanted to spend the rest of his life wrestling bears. So May 15th, 1903, that is when Benny left the farm and entered into what we would call wrestling school. It wasn't called that at the time because wrestling wasn't what it is now. It was becoming what it is now, right? So pro wrestling comes from the Greco-Roman style mixed with the collar and elbow style competition mixed with the catch-as-catch-can submission style. And that all kind of formulated from legitimate contest into, hey, we're doing this at carnivals to make money from people. And, hey, have the townspeople come fight the wrestler. But first, they got to have a fake match first to show that it's possible. And maybe you can beat them, right? So it just slowly became what we know as today, which is what we call a work, right? Where it's like, it's predetermined. But it was still in that process. It hadn't fully been defined to what it is now, but it was slowly becoming more territorialized, more permanent. It was less of the traveling carnival show. So Bear Bottom Benny goes off. He's 13 years old. He starts training with a local semi-local promoter, right, in Iowa. And that wrestling school, as we call it now, is not what it was called then. It wasn't really called anything. It isn't what it is now, right? They didn't just like walk in and know that wrestling was kind of predetermined and that would just learn how to run the ropes and take back bumps and shake everyone's hand and take selfies for Instagram, right? Like it's not the way it was. You worked hard on this promoter's farm for free to build up your tendon strength, your tendon muscles, right, to get actual strength. And then you would, Farmer Burns at the time, he was one of the most famous wrestlers of the time, had a pamphlet out that had exercise routines, and it was calisthenics, and it was some free weights and dumbbell type things, and it was wrestling. And they would just wrestle until bedtime, and then they would wake up the next day, work all day, do their workout, and wrestle again. And that's how he got so strong. That's how Bear Bottom Benny got so strong. And he did that for, let's see, he got there in 1903, 1906. He did it for 3 years. 3 years of this. So this guy's strong. He's 16. He's ready to enter the world of professional wrestling, right? And again, professional wrestling was different back then. You had to be a legit guy. You had to know how to defend yourself against other wrestlers because, again, some of it was predetermined. Quite a bit of it was, more than we probably realize now, or some people probably think. It was more predetermined than you think, but it had to look legitimate. And also, there were always the people who wanted to take advantage of you. There were always the carnival challenges where you had to go wrestle against a stranger or a local or another pro wrestler posing as a local who was trying to win to take the winner's purse, which was at the time, $20 or $30, which would be equivalent to $100 or a couple $100 these days. It just depends. It was all kinds of stuff like that. So he had to be an actually tough guy, right? So Bear Bottom Benny enters the circuit, immediately gets a fan base. Immediately. They called him the Bear Hug Brigade. The Bear Hug hadn't become a move quite yet, but so I'm kind of getting my timeline a little screwy here, but they were the Bear Hug Brigade, and they would wear bear ears to the matches. They made them out of cotton balls. They'd dye them brown, big fat cotton balls, and wear them on their head. These guys like the Beatles of 1910s professional wrestling. But next, we have his rise to fame. All right. Bear Bottom Benny's questionable, dubious, infamous rise to fame in the 1910 Bear Brawl Bonanza of Kansas City is what you may have heard of that. So he had an opponent that night. Bear Bottom Benny had an opponent, and this is some real alliteration here, guys. We have Bear Bottom Benny against Bruno the Beast Baldwin, right? So all through wrestling school, Benny had to wrestle other men, other boys, right? And he didn't want to do that, but he did that as a means to an end. He just wanted to wrestle bears, and we'll find out his motivations a little later. But he wanted to wrestle bears. He didn't want to wrestle people, but he did it just to learn the ropes, pardon the pun, right? Quite literally learn the ropes and to get into the business. But he didn't start wrestling bears. But this night changed everything, right? So he's supposed to wrestle someone who was known as a bear wrestler, Bruno Baldwin, who was ruthless, right? Like this guy wanted to hurt bears. He hated bears. He thought it was funny. He would try to injure them and things like that. He was just a real dick. And Benny was the opposite. We found out years later, Benny's whole motivation for wrestling bears wasn't because he was afraid of bears or wanted to hurt bears. It's because he wanted to protect bears. It's wild, but think about it, right? So Whiskers got his shoulder broken by Benny by accident. They didn't put Whiskers down. You want to know what happened to Whiskers? He had his shoulder separated. They mended his shoulder. They fixed it. They popped it back in place in it, and they let it heal. And he performed for several more years until he died of alcoholism, right? He had a happy life. So using that lesson as a way forward, Benny knew that bears in the circus or bears in the carnival, they would have bad lives unless they were popular. So he made it his goal to wrestle and make famous as many bears as possible so that they could live good lives. They could have big open pens with bear families, be fed well, be protected in case they were sick or had an injury. People would want to keep these bears alive if these bears were making them money. That's altruism. Bear Bottom Benny was a bear savior. He absolutely loved it. But the polar opposite was Bruno Baldwin, Bruno the Beast. He wanted to hurt bears. So back in these times, you didn't have X or Twitter or whatever, right? You couldn't just hop on and make a YouTube video about your opponent or film a wrestling promo and build up a match. What they would do is they would send one of the guys to the town a little early, usually the bad guy, but it didn't always matter, to stir up some shit, basically, right? So they sent Bruno Baldwin to town to talk a bunch of shit about Benny, right? So he starts talking about, Benny he wants to wrestle bears, and he made a bunch of accusations about, Benny, which was just ridiculous, about Benny, having, unclean relationships, I guess you should say, with bears, and just really awful, disgusting stuff. And Benny, Bear Bottom went nuts. He was fired up. So the day of the match, as I mentioned, there was a bear brawl bonanza. So obviously it's not going to go very well for everybody here in 1910. They get to the match, and Benny's furious. I mean, he's furious. They barely get a few. These fights would go, it'd be the best 3 out of 5 rounds. Sometimes these things would go hours, right? 4 or 5 hours. Sometimes it wouldn't be a winner just because the guys couldn't continue. So the match starts, the bout starts. Benny does 2 things. Okay, he does 2 things here. One great, one terrible. The great thing is he invents something we now know as the bear hug. And the bear hug is kind of what it sounds like. You're kind of stomach to stomach with your opponent. You wrap your arms kind of around their rib cage and lift them up in the air, and you kind of squeeze them. He walks out and just straight up grabs Baldwin by his torso, picks him up in the air, and starts squeezing him so hard. And so he invented a move. And then the second thing that he did was he took a man's life. Right. And we can speculate. We can say it was on purpose. We can say it was on accident. But that day, Bear Bottom Benny Jenkins took the life of Bruno the Beast Baldwin. The local newspaper described it as a browniker, which is an amalgamation of the word massacre and brown, because as Benny was squeezing Baldwin, I think the modern day way to put it would be it was like if you grabbed a tube of toothpaste with the cap off and just gave it a good squeeze, what would happen? Except it was in Baldwin's pants and it was brown. I think that's about as clear and as tastefully as I can say that. And Baldwin succumbed to his injuries and passed away. There were no charges pressed. These things happened all the time. I mean, people would get choked out. Referees wouldn't know what chokes were when guys would get choked out, you know, and people died all the time in pro wrestling back then. So it wasn't even that big of a deal, but he was a local favorite. Baldwin was a local favorite, even though he was just a real piece of shit. He was a local fan favorite. The crowd was riotous. They started going crazy. They wanted to kill Benny, but the promoter had a great idea. He let a bear loose in the crowd. The bear started going crazy, attacking people. What did Benny do? He ran right out. He grabbed the bear. He picked him up sideways, and he held him in what looked like a bear hug, but he was coddling the bear to sleep. The bear fell asleep. Everyone thought that he squeezed the bear to death like he did Baldwin, but the bear was asleep. There was no brown. The bear went to sleep right then and there. And immediately Benny was a hero. The crowd went crazy. They loved him. He was, when he would give a bear hug to a human, it was vigorous and violent. But when he gave a bear hug to a bear, it was to end the match in a peaceful way. They would think he was knocking out these bears. Well, immediately, he became the world famous bear wrestler. I mean, right away. I mean, that was the story of Bear Bottom Benny, the famous bear wrestler. And then, he would get to know the bears. He had, extensive cuddle sessions and everything with the bears to get to know their families and everything before the bouts so that they would work with them. Right. I mean, not all bears were trained wrestlers. I know it sounds ridiculous, but some bears were trained. Not all of them were. Some of them were just wild. Promoters would cheap out and just get a literal just bear from the woods and bring it in. So Benny he did want to hurt these bears, so he had to figure out how to defend himself. So he'd befriend the bears, but then when they would come out for the match, they'd play along. They'd look ferocious. It was absolutely wild. The newspapers hated him. They saw right through it. They knew that he was working with the bears. They knew that it was what they called hippodrome, right? It was ballyhoo. It was humbug. It wasn't on the level. They weren't athletic contests. They could tell that he was working with the bears. He was protecting the bears. They called him Bumbling Benny. There were people that would sell bootleg bear pattern trousers out in the merchandise. Out front of the events as merchandise, and Benny saw none of that money. But it was right around June 1914. I mean, the press was just at a fever pitch. The fans loved this guy, but the press couldn't stand him. And that brings us to the incident, right? You knew it was coming. August 15th, 1915, the Springfield State Fair. Before the show, somebody brings just an enormous pot of bean chili and honey, right? There was a chili cook-off at the fair. This was the third prize-winning chili, and a mysterious stranger, brought a bunch of it to Benny. And Benny was a sweetheart, by all accounts, just the nicest guy. And, of course, this is honey, but what do bears love? This guy lived his life as a bear. He loved bears, so honey chili, great. He ate the whole pot. Another factor, it was a hot day. It was unseasonably hot. Right? It was August, so it was hot, but it was even hotter than usual. It was 104 degrees, according to the almanac. Benny had the match of his life that day. That day, Benny was wrestling Bald Beauregard. He was a bear with a bald head. He was bear pattern baldness. He was bald on top, and he was ferocious. I mean, absolutely ferocious, just a big brown bear, just big, 700-800 pounds. The stats are murky, but he was apparently enormous, right? It's a match of his life. And he was not trained. He was a wild bear. I mean, he was a performance bear, but he was not trained in pro wrestling. So Benny had the odds against him. It was a hot day. He ate so much honey chili, and he was wrestling a bear that he couldn't trust. That afternoon, mid-match, what would have been mid-match ended up being the end of the match and a lot of things. Back then they had 3-point pins, right? So it would be like either, both your hips and your shoulder, or 2 shoulders and 1 hip, whatever. So both of Bear Bottom Benny's hips were on the mat. His shoulders were up. The bear, the big bald bear, leapt up into the air and was about to come down. But first, all of his weight down on Benny. Benny tried to roll out of the way, rolled over onto his stomach. The bear landed right on his lower back. You hear Benny, people who were there said you heard Benny just scream out in pain. Immediately following the scream was the stench, filling the air. The front row almost immediately smelled the pungent, thick, almost viscous smell. And then they saw it. As the 4th, 5th, 6th row started to get the smell, the people up front could see seeping out of Bear Bottom Benny's his trunks, his short pants. They could see seeping out, oozing brown. Immediately, everyone's holding their nose. There are people vomiting in the corner. The smell is so pungent, it's so bad. But then following all the sickness was the laughter. Immediately people started laughing at Benny. Benny did the brown, they started saying. Benny browned his pants. Benny got brown running down. People yelling all these different things. And then the flash bulbs start going off. Of course, the press already hates Benny, right? They already hate him. They're talking all about how they're taking all these photos. These are going to be plastered all over the news. Immediately, Benny, there's a bear sitting on his back, and Benny's saying, "It's not me. It's not me. The bear did it. The bear did it. It's not me. I didn't do the brown." The next day, the Springfield Scoop headline was the following: Bear wrestler poops more than the bear. Another local newspaper had a headline: Local wrestler's brown turns wrestling world upside down. And on and on and on. The story went on for weeks. For weeks. Benny kept defending himself. He was reached out for interviews. People were sending him letters. He was responding in kind. He wrote a letter. Woodrow Wilson made a joke about Benny that made it into the newspaper. And Benny wrote a letter to the president that was never responded to. He was a punchline. People on schoolyards would call, if you were teasing someone on the schoolyard in that time, you would say, Benny the Bear Butt Boy, Benny the Bear Butt Boy. He's got brown running down. He's got brown running down. It was relentless. His life was ruined. His career was over. It was over. He was a laughingstock. Who would ever take him seriously again? He was one of the strongest yet sweetest men, performers, professional wrestlers on the planet. But his career was over because promoters couldn't trust him. Were they going to get brown running down on all their mats? Were they going to put him on a poster and people wouldn't even come because they didn't even care? They don't think that laughingstock could beat anybody. The conspiracy theories started. Benny got desperate. He kept his story straight for a long time. He said it wasn't him. Then at one point he was so desperate because, listen, this was his income. This was his whole livelihood. He built his whole life around this. It was his dream. He started saying that wrestling was fake, that this was predetermined, that was the story. He was supposed to have it was fake brown, that it was ketchup that they dyed brown with some food coloring, right? They put some green food coloring and some ketchup and made it brown, and it was fake. And that wasn't true. And it just wasn't true. He was just getting desperate. He was desperate for anyone to believe his side of it. But the world and the country and the newspapers, they just didn't. Nobody believed it. Because how could that even be possible? So Benny did what, anybody else would do, and he sued. Benny sued several local newspapers and a couple of national newspapers for libel. He sued them for their slanderous claims about him. And there was a trial set for March 28th, 1915 is when the trial began. And Benny got a great attorney, Saul Silverman, an excellent attorney, just known for representing people who were believed to be innocent. I mean, I'm not trying to say that that's not what all lawyers do, but I mean, he wasn't like some kind of like slick, he wasn't like an O.J. Simpson lawyer, right? Like he only defended people he believed were innocent, right? And the problem is, though, he was also a showman. He got a lot of headlines. That's how he got a lot of clients. So on the first day of the trial, March 28th, 1916, Saul, his attorney, shows up wearing a bear outfit to the trial. And the judge immediately tries to say, you can't wear that here. And his attorney, Saul Silverman, says, if a bear can wrestle, why can't a bear be an attorney? And the judge was like, I'm paraphrasing, but like, good point. You do you. Sounds good. And to Saul's credit, he wore that bear costume for the rest of the trial, which went on for 19 weeks. They called witness after witness after witness. It was an absolute circus. It was an absolute circus of a trial. Not long after the trial began, the public sentiment started to turn back in Benny's favor. His fans came back and they were split, right? They would come every night, overnight there, the next morning, there'd be more fans sitting outside of the courthouse protesting or supporting Benny than there were the night before. It was unbelievable, but they were split. Half the fans believed that he did do it, and half the fans believed that he didn't. And the ones who believed that he did do the brown thought that it was okay. So there were chants that would ring out. Half of them would say, the bear did the brown. The bear did the brown. And the other half would say, Benny probably did the brown, but it's okay. Benny probably did the brown, but it's okay. So either way, he had the support. They called pro wrestlers up on the stand. They called the bear. They brought the bear back, the big bald bear. They brought him back on the stand. And then that was a whole mess because then, he just went nuts in the courtroom. The bear went nuts in the courtroom and tore the whole place up, and they had to change a venue, and the trial was delayed a week. I mean, it was just an absolute disaster. But to their credit, they tried to get to the bottom of it. But there weren't DNA experts back then. There was no forensic files. There was no, court TV wasn't around. They couldn't figure this out. They brought in fabric experts to test the fabric. They brought in supposed dung experts who were inconclusive. They essentially they had to prove who did the brown, but no one knew how to prove that. That never happened before. They brought out Benny's wrestling short pants, and ironically and unfortunately, they were Exhibit P, which we all know what that stands for. Poop. Right? Get it out. Laugh it up. This is a man's life we're talking about here. And Benny, to his credit, took the stand and bawled. I mean, he bawled like a baby. Just emotional testimony about his love for wrestling, why he started wrestling bears, to help bears, that he would never lie about a bear doing the brown because he loves bears more than anybody. He admitted that the incident was real, that he lied when he said that it was predetermined, that was brown ketchup, but that it was real, but it wasn't him. The bear shit in his tights. The bear did the brown. The gallery burst into applause. There were people crying, people throwing things in the air. The judge made all the gallery leave. He cleared out the courtroom, and it was September 1st, 1916. It was a bench trial. It was not a jury trial, unfortunately. The judge ruled in favor of the media. It was a surprise to everybody. The world had glommed on to this story, right? It was the first time that a newspaper headline had an expletive in the title. I mean, because like I said, people were torn. Either way, for the most part, they supported Benny. Even the press had turned. The press had turned around. There was a headline in the New York Times in 1916 that said, "Shit happens. The bear might have done the brown, but it doesn't matter." That was groundbreaking. That was groundbreaking. That was unbelievable. Bear Bottom Benny changed the culture for people, bears, and the media and pro wrestling. But the judge didn't buy it. Saul and Benny and the rest, they couldn't prove it. They couldn't prove that the bear did the brown. So the case was thrown out. Benny had to pay all the legal fees of the newspapers, who ironically now supported him. And Benny built a cabin in the woods. He went out with his hands, with his strong, enormous hands, and he never wrestled again. He went out to the woods and built a cabin. That was in 1916. But, there's always a but, 8 years later, 1924, that same bald bear attacks a trainer. A trainer comes into the pen. The bear attacks him, does the same attack, the same jumping attack. The guy spins over to roll out of the way. Bear lands on his back, shits in the trainer's pants. The media goes nuts. This was the brown smoking gun. The bear did the brown. The bear did the shit. Everybody went crazy. The headlines were, the bear did the brown, the bear did the brown, because people still knew what it was. It was a cultural moment. It was bigger than the Titanic, man. It was crazy. It was, it was what everybody wanted to talk about. They went out, they tracked down Benny. He's out in the woods. He had started the country's first bear sanctuary. He started in the woods in Iowa. It's unbelievable. It's still there, just outside of Grizzly Gulch. And it's the country's biggest independent bear sanctuary still to this day. And the media, they had all these ceremonies. They wanted to formally apologize. They did a ceremonial $1 settlement, to say like, hey, we were wrong. Here you go. Benny didn't want it. Benny kicked them all off his property. The last quote that we have from Benny, and he lived a long life by all accounts. We don't have the exact date of death. Obviously, he's not still alive, but we don't have the exact date of death. We do know that he had a family, he had his bears, and he had a good life. From by all accounts, or at least that's the story that they tell around town. But the last thing that he said to the news before he kicked him off of his property was, "It doesn't matter if you know that the bear did the brown, because I've known all along that I didn't do the brown and that the bear did the brown." It's powerful, man. That's powerful. There's a lot to learn from this story, right? Rushing to judgment, the Frankenstein, nature of the media, right? The torch and pitchforks. To this day, in Grizzly Gulch, Iowa, there is a statue erected to Benny's honor, and he's standing hand in hand with two big grizzlies right in the center of town. And I don't know what they did, but a lot of times these bronze statues, statues are almost 100 years old now. They're about 93 years old now. I don't know what they did, but they're bronze statues. A lot of times bronze turns color, like the Statue of Liberty with all the salt air turns green, it gets discolored. I don't know what they did. But to this day, the statue of Bear Bottom Benny Jenkins and the two grizzly bears, right now, as we speak, to this day, the statue's brown.
In the town, not too far away, lived a man named Bear Bottom Benny. Tales of his mishap spreading from miles to years, never ending. In a wrestling match with a fearsome beast, Benny tussled with a bear. Oh, fierce and the laughter grew. As Benny clenched his fists, feeling blue, he tried to explain, he tried to shout,